Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. Thank you very much indeed for wanting to watch this video. But just before it starts, here's a short but important message. It really does take a lot of time and money to produce our events, the videos, and all the campaigning work that we do. So if you're not already a subscription member, please do become one. That's really important. You'll find all the details you need through the link that you can see on the screen now. And if for any reason you're unable to become a subscription member, please at least make a donation. You'll see the link for our donations page coming up on the screen now. And just in case you need them, the links to both of those pages are in the video description. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so I'll introduce myself. I'll set the scene for what we're going to be doing today, and then quite shortly we will be observing a minute's silence in relation to the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise, which means that we exist to make an impact as opposed to making a profit. Our formal mission statement is about the idea of promoting reform of the financial services sector so that it serves society better. Over the last 7 years, we have, quite frankly, become increasingly concerned about the lack of effectiveness of the Financial Conduct Authority in relation to its responsibility for providing an appropriate degree of consumer protection. Those concerns about the lack of effectiveness of the FCA were articulated, I think, very clearly by many people that were involved in the BBC Panorama programme that was aired a few weeks ago. Whilst the Panorama programme focused on the Blackmore bond scandal, the principles behind the programme applied also, of course, to LCNF, to Woodford, to Connaught Income Series 1, and frankly, a very, very long list of other investment scandal cases. We think that two things need to happen. First of all, those that have already been harmed as a consequence of chronic and perhaps even catastrophic regulatory failure ought to have a fair and reasonable chance of becoming fully compensated for their loss. And secondly, we believe reforms need to be made that help to mitigate the risk of that kind of chronic and catastrophic regulatory failure happening again. And it is our belief at the Transparency Task Force that the Financial Services and Markets Bill provides a perhaps once in a generation opportunity to introduce real and meaningful reforms that would, quite frankly, make it much less likely that the Financial Conduct Authority will continue to fail in relation to its consumer protection responsibilities. Today's meeting is therefore a gathering of interested stakeholders who want to work collaboratively and introduce those kind of reforms within the financial services and markets bill that is currently working its way through Parliament. After we've observed the 1 minute silence for the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, I'll be asking my very good Transparency Task Force colleague Mark Bishop to share with you all in a bit more detail our thoughts around the kind of amendments that could and should be made in the bill to boost the levels of protections that consumer can experience. We'll then invite the parliamentarians who are with us today to share their thoughts, and time permitting, we'll open it up to everybody else so we can have a reasonably lightly facilitated discussion about the issues and about what can be done. I should also mention that we've got an interesting group of people here with us today. We have various parliamentarians, and frankly, we're very, very pleased to have the time of the parliamentarians that are here with us today. Thank you very much for being here. We also have various parliamentary assistants and senior advisors. We have members of the media. Of course, this topic is of great interest to the media. You know, the newspapers are read by citizens, and consumer protection is naturally going to be of great interest to a huge number of people in society as a whole. And without a doubt, this is a major public interest issue. We also have individuals from various communities that represent consumer interests also. Later in the session, we'll be hearing from Jennifer at Compassion in Politics. In fact, just before Mark speaks, we'll be hearing from Jennifer. Jennifer will talk about the importance of parliamentarians working collaboratively on public interest issues like this, issues that simply are not are not party political in any way. These issues, these concerns apply right across the political spectrum. And of course, we also have with us today various individuals who have personally lost life-changing amounts of money as a direct consequence of the kind of chronic and catastrophic regulatory failure that many people have sadly experienced. So I hope that gives you all a feel for the program that we have in place and what we're going to be covering. We'll try to make the session as inclusive and as participative as we can, particularly in relation to some of the legal issues. We have 3 individuals with a strong legal background who are here today who are going to be chipping in with their thoughts about how we might go about the, if you like, the tactics and the strategies of making these amendments all fall into place. So I hope that sets the scene. The time by my watch is 12:22. We're now going to, as I said earlier, observe a minute's silence. I'll time that for everybody. And of course, this is a minute's silence in relation to the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. We'll start that. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Jennifer Nadell from Compassion in Politics, could I please invite you to take us off of mute? Thank you. Take a moment, if you don't mind, to introduce yourself, talk about, in very brief terms, the work of Compassion in Politics and how you believe the idea of parliamentarians working collaboratively is the way forward on public interest issues like this that are not in any way party political. Jennifer, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's a privilege to be here with you all. So we founded Compassion in Politics in 2018 due to the belief that politics should be about the alleviation of avoidable suffering, but that had got lost in the political melee, you know, the tug of war that we have at the moment, which is too often partisan, which is too often charged in a way that makes collaboration difficult. So we came into existence to promote compassion as a value. If politics had lost its way, then compassion can provide its moral compass. We work on a cross-party basis, raising issues that all right-thinking parliamentarians want to do something about, and facilitating a cross-party response on those issues. We provide the Secretariat for an APPG, and we've had the active engagement of over 100 MPs from every political party coming together to try and find solutions to problems that affect us all. And allied to the absence of compassion, and this is clearly an issue that relates so strongly to this, you know, people who should have been protected, who weren't protected, who suffered catastrophic harm as a result of that lack of protection. And it's something clearly that Parliament needs to act on to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Allied with this is a second issue, which is the health of our democracy. Faith in politics is diminishing, and that risks undermining or weakening our democratic contract. And we've done polling, and the issue that voters feel overwhelmingly most strongly about is honesty. So we asked voters to rank values, and honesty came out on top, and 3/4 of those polled by opinion also would have supported a law to stop making misrepresentation in politics a practice that can continue without correction. So we strongly support the work that's being done here. It crosses party lines. Anyone who's interested in alleviating avoidable suffering, doing the right thing morally, and also promoting honesty as a method to reinvigorate our democratic process and make up for the deficit in faith in politicians should be on the side of this cause. And thank you so much. And I really look forward to working with you if we can be of any assistance in creating a forum for that discussion to happen.
Jennifer, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts there. Your organisation's purpose aligns so strongly with us. I'm sure we'll be finding ample opportunities to work together. We're now going to be asking Mark Bishop to share his thoughts. Now, please understand, everybody, that the Transparency Task Force is an international community of individuals working collaboratively to campaign for reform, the kind of reforms that are all about protecting ordinary people. And we have volunteers that put in, varying amounts of time and effort. I can honestly tell you that the amount of time and effort that Mark Bishop has been putting into not just the matters we're discussing today, but others as well, is frankly quite astonishing. Mark is a very highly motivated and a very, very capable individual. And I think of myself as being extremely lucky to have Mark's input into the sorts of matters that the Transparency Task Force is very focused on. Mark will be speaking for roughly 30 minutes or so. This is really the backbone of today's meeting. We are effectively asking ourselves the question, what reforms could be made through the Financial Services and Markets Bill that have the greatest opportunity to realistically make a long-lasting difference to this regulatory reform landscape? Mark Bishop, over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Andy. and thanks for your kind words. It's a great honour to have this platform. So the first thing I'm going to do is to share slides. So you'll notice that I've headlined it Consumer Protection, Promoting Consumer Rights, rather than Consumer Protection. And that is deliberate because, of course, protecting consumers is important, but giving them rights is broader than that. And I hope that we will be able to achieve both of these goals by implementing some of the amendments that we are proposing to the forthcoming Financial Services and Markets Bill. Where you'll see yellow, by the way, in these slides, that's a link, and I will upload the presentation slides after presenting them. So you'll be able to follow these links. So the Financial Services and Markets Bill, I'm going to provide a quick overview of it. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reset UK financial services regulation. It should pass into law by late spring of 2023. Its key purpose is the onshoring of EU powers to principally the UK Parliament. There are opportunities to amend it, as there are with any piece of legislation. I think a lot of campaigners tend to focus on opposing or trying to redraft what they perceive to be negative clauses. That is not an approach that we are taking for reasons that I will describe. Instead, we think it's far more important to make the case for including new rights and protections, things that aren't currently drafted or foreseen by the bill, but are necessary. And we are doing this by focusing on righting what are widely acknowledged historical wrongs, anomalies and lacunae. So we're not trying to get something that Parliament never intended us to have. We're trying to get things that should have been there from the outset, tidying up loose ends, if you like. There is compelling proof that there is a need to upweight consumer rights in financial services. Many of you will have seen that there was an edition of Panorama broadcast just less than a month ago called the £1 billion savings scandal. It focused partly on one particular case, Blackmore Bond, where the Financial Conduct Authority failed at least 3 times to act on very credible intelligence it was given that consumers were being ripped off, that a fraud was being perpetrated on them, and these people lost £47 million. But the programme also made a wider point that there have been many cases like this. London Capital of Finance, Connaught, one that has emerged again this week is Woodford, the Woodford Equity Investment Fund. It wasn't exactly a fraud, it wasn't really a scam, but it certainly was a case where there was misconduct and there was regulatory failure. And the sum of money that one of the firms involved in it has been asked to set aside for consumer redress is approximately 1/10 of the money lost by consumers. It's unclear where the rest will come from. There is a new Prime Minister, of course, and it's been widely reported, and there's a link here, that she is aware that the FCA is a problem child. And she is generally concerned about the issue of regulators in the UK, regulatory capture and complacency. So we're working in an environment in which there is a recognition that there are problems that need to be addressed. And finally, there's the call for evidence about the FCA, and there is a link here. I should explain that Transparency Task Force provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. And in the summer of 2021, we were asked to help the APPG understand better the perceptions of the FCA by gathering evidence from people who had interactions with it. And we are still processing that information. We expected perhaps 40 or 50 responses. We had about 170. And there is some astonishing stuff in there. I've been critical of the regulator for some years. There's stuff in there that I would never have imagined, particularly from current and former employees of the regulator, which is itself quite fascinating. So I'm now going to talk about our proposed amendments, and again in yellow, when you get the slides, and I'll upload them later, you'll be able to follow a link to a briefing document. I'll provide an overview of those amendments now. But first I'll kind of do that from the perspective of what our philosophy is, and it's that politics is the art of the possible. For clarity, we are not proposing to try and reinvent the structures of UK financial regulation. We are also not challenging the competitiveness and deregulation agendas. On the contrary, our amendments will strengthen the competitiveness of our financial services industry, and they will help to reduce the burden of regulation on honest actors. But what we are doing is addressing known regulatory anomalies, fixing perverse incentives and improving governance. The intended outcomes are creating conditions that nudge the industry and regulators to behave or become more responsive and accountable to consumer interests, and thereby to rebuild confidence in the financial services industry. You'll be aware in the Edelman Trust Barometer that financial services is the least trusted sector of our economy other than social media. And of course, social media is almost unregulated currently. All kinds of bad things happen there. There is clearly an opportunity for the industry to perform better, to gain revenue and profit, simply by having consumers and small businesses trust it. And our approach is based on 3 universal truths, which I can sum up with 3 little aphorisms. If you screw up, you should pay up. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, and sunlight is the best disinfectant. But our overall message is this: these measures are offensively reasonable. Therefore, obstructing them is intrinsically and unavoidably unreasonable. So here is if you like, the meat in the sandwich, the 3 amendments. The first one is based on the principle, if you, meaning regulators, screw up, you should pay up. So if we take the case of the Panorama edition that I mentioned, here are Blackmore bond investors who've lost £47 million, and there is a regulator that was told that they were being defrauded, was actually given access to the room next to the one in which the fraudsters were operating, so they could hear the fraudsters scamming people, and they chose not to take up the offer. So how do we make those people liable? Well, here's the problem. The problem actually is in the legislation. The FCA has enjoyed immunity from civil liability, bar a couple of carve-outs that have never been used, since the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000 came into effect. If you read the Hansard debates about that act, when it was a bill, the intention in creating this immunity from civil liability was absolutely not that the regulator would get off scot-free if it screwed up. That was not the intention. Rather, it was to avoid consumers having the cost of litigation, and to a degree, avoiding the risk of sensitive matters about, regulatory investigations appearing in an open court. Now, in mitigation of this immunity, the Parliament then created a complaint scheme. It required the regulators to set up a complaint scheme to deal with these matters, and it believed that therefore consumers would be given redress if there was regulatory failure. Unfortunately, it made some mistakes, in my view, in my humble opinion, in drafting this legislation. It allowed the regulators to set the rules of the complaint scheme. It allowed them to appoint the complaints commissioner who deals with the complaints and set her budget, and also to ignore her findings. They are merely advisory. As a result, back in early summer, the current complaints commissioner was giving evidence to the Treasury Committee, and she said the following: ex gratia compensation payments due to regulatory failures on the part of the FCA will in practice never be available to complainants. They will never be available. Well, they won't unless we change the rules. So here is what we are proposing by way of an amendment to the Financial Services and Markets Bill. It should mandate that the complaint scheme can cover regulatory failure losses. It should make the Complaints Commissioner findings binding on regulators. And as a backstop, because of course, Complaints Commissioner is imperfect, can only investigate the material that she's given, there should be an end to the civil immunity of the FCA, and we should disapply the Limitation Act for the first 6 years, so people with legacy claims can come forward and secure redress where a court or the Complaints Commissioner deems it appropriate. This is really a backstop for where the FCA is unable or unwilling to secure redress from firms. Of course, it will become much more assertive in its relationship with firms if it knows that it's on the hook for the losses it's unable to secure by means of enforcement. So immediately, the scale of the losses that we're talking about will shrink. Amendment 2, based on the principle, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So if we're making the FCA liable when it's got things wrong, perhaps we should also do so to the industry. Well, actually, consumer advocates have been campaigning for this since the Financial Services and Markets Bill of 1999 that became the Act of 2000. What we've been asking for is a statutory duty of care. It would be owed by authorised persons, which means the firms and managers that appear on the FCA register, to consumers, as defined under FSMA and then the Financial Services Act 2012. Parliament was persuaded of the need for such a thing, the duty of care, last year. And when it passed the Financial Services Act 2021, it introduced section 29, which I've linked to, which obliged the FCA to consult on and implement rules about a duty of care. Unfortunately, for whatever reason we may speculate, the FCA didn't like this idea, so it gamed the rule that was imposed on it. It consulted on and has brought forward rules about what it calls a consumer duty. The consumer duty is not in any legal sense a duty of care. There are many exemptions that things that you'll be covered for under the duty of care, you're not covered for under consumer duty. For example, if an authorised firm hands over a client or subcontracts to an unauthorised firm, that's tough if something goes wrong. There is no contractual link. There is no way in which the person can be helped if they don't have a contractual link with the firm in question. Historic injustices such as mortgage prisoners' plight are not dealt with, and there is not an end to exit fees, despite these things not apparently being in keeping with the consumer duty. But perhaps the most important flaw of the consumer duty is that it is of no value at all unless the FCA chooses to enforce against it. The FCA's record on enforcement is appalling. Many wrongs against which it does not enforce. In particular, it very seldom obtains redress for consumers, whether using a restitution order or its redress powers. Has statutory powers, seldom uses them. If consumers had a private right of action, which by definition they would in a duty of care, they would have the right to litigate to recover their losses. A duty of care would give them that by definition. Consumer duty could have been written to include this. The FCA, again, for reasons we will speculate about, chose not to do this. So consumers are wholly disempowered. So our proposed amendment to the bill, you will not be surprised, is a statutory duty of care to be owed by authorised persons to consumers. Amendment 3 is based on the aphorism that sunlight is the best disinfectant, a quote from the American judge Louis Brandeis. The FCA is currently answerable to 3 industry panels, 1 consumer one. These are statutory panels. It's required to have regard to what they say, and it's supposed to either comply with what they say or publish its reasons for not doing so. It doesn't really do that, but it should be doing it. The Financial Services and Markets Bill would actually make this kind of imbalance even worse. It would change the ratio to 5 or even 6 to 1, because it will create 2 more industry panels, and it will actually create what's called a cost benefit analysis panel, which in theory is not for the industry or for consumers, but we fear it could be kind of packed with management consultants who work for the financial services industry, who want to make the case that it's not worth having big regulation that creates a financial burden on the industry, because there might not be a commensurate benefit to consumers. So even if you don't agree with that, it's a 5 to 1 ratio against consumers, which is really wrong. You know, given that the FCA's operational objectives, which are to do with consumer protection, competition and market integrity, impact hugely on consumers, whose voices are seldom heard. I would also say the consumer panel is appointed by the FCA itself. It's not allowed to criticise the regulator without giving forewarning. It's a long time since it's criticised the regulator. So what we need, we think, is a consumer-led oversight body, which basically would keep an eye on the regulator and would make public statements if it believed that there was a problem. It's very much similar to something that was introduced in Australia following the Royal Commission into the banking financial services industry there, and we believe it's much needed. So our proposed amendment is to introduce a statutory Financial Regulators Supervision Council, which we call the FRSC. Now, this is a new concept, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what its roles would be. So its roles actually have to do with tidying up, fixing a lot of anomalies that have occurred either from the outset since FSMA or that have been created by fate since then. So the first one is an input to hiring and firing. So jointly with the Treasury, it would have a role in the appointment and removal of the Chair and Chief Executive of the FCA. Currently, those roles sit solely with the Treasury. we think that a little bit more consumer representation, a bit more transparency would be beneficial in this area. And it would have sole responsibility for appointing 2 of the FCA's non-executive directors. The intention back in the day was that they would be appointed on behalf of consumers by the National Consumer Council. The NCC was abolished and it went to the government's business department. So again, we just think it'd be good to bring it back to consumers. It would be also responsible for appointing the directors of the Financial Ombudsman Service. Currently, that is done by the FCA, potential conflict of interest. Just last year, they put in one of their own people as the acting chief executive. She then got implicated in a particular unfortunate lobbying of Parliament, of regulators' case, and she then had to step down. It would be responsible, the Council, for appointing the members and the chair of the consumer panel. As I've mentioned at the moment, currently they're appointed by the FCA, which feels like a conflict and a constraint on what they can do. And also the Complaints Commissioner, who herself, in our evidence session with the Treasury Committee, pointed out that there was a problem with how she's appointed and would like to change it. So those are 3 areas of hiring and firing. The next is reviews. The Council would be responsible for publishing an annual review into the FCA and its regulatory regime. Currently, nobody is doing this. It can't do any harm for somebody to do it. It could well help. Periodically, it could publish reviews about the FCA's treatment of whistleblowers and their evidence. We have grave concerns about the way that both whistleblowers and their evidence have been treated by the FCA over many years. You will see it as a common thread in Blackmore Bond, London Capital and Finance, Connaught, and many more cases of regulatory failure. It would commission, but not conduct, it would commission and oversee independent reviews after regulatory failures. At the moment, the FCA commissions these, which obviously leads to some concerns about how independent they really are. Finally, it would oversee the complaint scheme rules, budgets, and payments. By payments, I mean make sure that the payments were made to the people who complained when they should have been paid out. At the moment, the FCA oversees the complaint scheme rules and budgets, and nobody really oversees the issue of the payments. So I'd like to talk about some of the objections that there may be to these amendments and try and overcome them. The first will come from the industry or from the Treasury as its proxy, and that is that civil liability of the FCA will impose a heavy financial burden on the industry. That's true. It is true. There would be a cost to the industry of the FCA having to compensate victims of regulatory failure, because the FCA's principal source of income is actually a levy on authorised firms. But actually, in a way, the minute they raise this argument, they've actually lost the debate, because what they're admitting is that there is a really big cost of regulatory failure. All they're saying is that they'd rather that consumers bore it than them. And actually, that's unfair, isn't it? Because consumers have narrower shoulders, and they are not the people who benefit from lax or captured regulation, as the industry on the whole does. The other thing, of course, is that at the moment, the honest majority in the industry perhaps could be argued to lose out as a result of this regulatory failure, because every time there's a story of like Blackmore Bond or London Capital Finance, any of those kinds of things, it acts as a deterrent to consumers using financial services. So the honest people are deprived of profit opportunities. And the industry therefore would gain from consumer demand being boosted by this extra safeguard being put in place. And also the industry, because it wouldn't like this burden, would demand better regulation. The honest majority would be knocking on the door of the regulators saying, you've got to do a better job. And they've got a louder voice, bigger share of a voice than we consumers have got. The next one is that waiving the Limitation Act is retroactive legislation. I actually think that that is untrue. The reason is that Parliament always intended that consumers would be compensated for regulatory failure. Unfortunately, the detail of how it happened, because they allowed the complaint scheme to be written by the regulators, meant that consumers were deprived of this money for a period of time. But there is, even if you disagree with that argument, there is an overriding reason why we should still waive the Limitation Act, so all of the legacy claims for regulatory failure can be paid out. And it's this: it's impossible to fix the FCA while it's still forced to deny past failings. The FCA, whenever it screws up, it gets locked into this delay, deny, do everything you can to try and avoid paying out. And while they're denying these things, they can't also be fixing them. And somewhere along the line, we've got to end the vicious spiral and actually solve the problem. A duty of care that some people will argue is not needed given the FCA's consumer duty. Well, I hope I've already explained why the consumer duty is materially inferior to a duty of care. Who funds the Financial Regulators Supervisory Council? Well, we are proposing it would be funded by a 1% top slice of the FCA's income. So the argument would be you'll get much better value out of the remaining 99% because of the kind of sapiential effect and oversight and questioning transparency brought about by this supervisory body. Who would run this FRSC? Well, we have deliberately in our drafting so far not tackled that issue. The reason is that actually it's difficult to come up with a solution that achieves two goals. The first is it's got to be not too radical so that government won't rail against it, but it's also got to be radical enough that it is going to be effective. So, for example, I would be strongly against it, saying that these people would be appointed by the Treasury or the FCA, because they're just going to put in a bunch of people from the city who will not challenge the FCA. So a box is ticked, but nothing changes. The other extreme would be, actually, you go to all of the campaigning groups in the sector, including us, and you ask us to appoint the people. That maybe is too radical. There may be a middle way. It could be something like that actually the Treasury might be running the process, but there would be a right of veto of individuals given to some of the campaigning groups, including us. So we would basically, if we could see those ringers being put in there from the city, we would stop it. So I'll now talk about the political context in which we're operating, because the key thing here really is that we need to understand that context and try and consider whether or not these proposals could be able to be supported by government, or at least government would not object if they're introduced to the late stage of the Lords. The first, which I've already alluded to, is that the PM reportedly accepts that the FCA is defective, and she is generally concerned that regulators may be captured by industry interests. Now, at some point, she has been reported to be considering a merger of the Financial Conduct Authority with the Prudent Regulatory Authority and the Payment Systems Regulator. Now, we think that that is quite a high-risk strategy, because what could happen, because the FCA is the biggest of those three bodies, is that its culture and leadership could kind of destroy the relatively effective PRA and PSR rather than them fixing the FCA. So it's risky. Our amendments are very pragmatic compared to that. They're small and they're low risk and they can be implemented quickly. But they do acknowledge and address the problems. As it stands, the Financial Services and Market Bill doesn't at all. The next thing is that there is a big focus on the competitiveness agenda and on deregulation. Well, we believe in the competitiveness agenda. In the UK, think of the number, for example, elderly people who live in under-occupied large family homes because they don't want to sell them and move their assets from bricks and mortar, which they perceive to be safe, into investments where they've heard of many of their friends and family having been ripped off. So that's a deadweight loss for the industry as well as society. If you can fix that, suddenly we become more competitive. As far as abroad is concerned, I happen to know personally, because of my own interactions with the European Commission, that it is very wary of the standards of financial regulation in the UK, and actually fears about that are a significant reason why the UK was not granted equivalence-based access to EU markets after Brexit. Now, if we can assuage those concerns by showing that actually we can have much better financial regulation, we can make the case for them to have that access. Even better than that, if we can show consumers abroad that our regulator is better than, for example, BaFin, the German regulator, which has screwed up a couple of times in the recent past, not as bad as the FCA, but it's certainly not perfect, we can persuade them, consumers abroad, that our financial services are the best. They will be knocking on the door of their governments, demanding that they should have an easy right to buy UK financial services. Wouldn't that be an amazing outcome for the city? On the deregulation front, the consumer duty, which, as I've said, has many exclusions, is of little value, is 121 pages of closely typed text. It's actually caused a price war for compliance staff, because so many small and medium-sized firms are now needing more help with compliance because they actually want to be on the right side of the law, that the salaries are going through the roof, and some firms can no longer afford compliance staff. They're having to take risks. That could mean that there's consumer jeopardy. A duty of care would be a paragraph, literally a paragraph. That's all you need. So we can go from imposing a huge cost on the honest majority of the industry to protect a small dishonest minority, to something far more effective that works for consumers and the honest majority in the industry. Isn't that deregulation that is also better regulation? Finally, populism. And whether you love populism or you hate it, and my view is very often the label is attached to things that aren't actually populism. It's not going to go away. So let's take some examples of how the political context, which is actually the public is quite populist in its nature at the moment, is well served by these amendments. The duty of care is fascinating. You know, our parliament, our elected parliament, placed an obligation on the statutory regulator. The statutory regulator basically flicked V's at parliamentarians and said, we'd rather not do that. We're not going to do it. We're going to do something slightly different and pretend that we complied. Now, that raised the question, who's sovereign, Parliament or the city? The next thing is that our proposals are offensively reasonable. Those three aphorisms: screw up and you pay up. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. People instinctively agree with this stuff. And when they see politicians trying to stop these things, they ask themselves why, whose interests are actually being served. Overall, my message therefore is this: there are many votes in consumer rights and there are none in corporatism. Okay, so now some questions and next steps. Is there broad support amongst parliamentarians, particularly for these proposed amendments? Are there any suggested tweaks or omissions? Does anyone already have suggested drafting they can share? If not, we would appreciate parliamentarians' help working with the legal team on drafting. Are there any MPs present or represented who are going to be on the Parliamentary Bill Committee? Is there still time to get on it for those who haven't volunteered? If so, and if eligible, please do so. Will the schedule of the Parliamentary Bill Committee, which is due to report by the 25th of October, change because of the Queen's passing? For example, that's changed the dates of Parliament. This means that it's possible that the reporting date of the committee may be pushed back. Also, probably the most important question, what are the best tactics for getting these amendments accepted? Firstly, by government, and secondly, otherwise. And the reason why I say government is actually a lot of Conservative MPs, I think, would instinctively support these things. You know, it's a Conservative value to be on the side of the grafters who make provision for their later years, the people who want to be homeowners, the people who borrow prudently. Why wouldn't you, entrepreneurs, why wouldn't you as a Conservative want those people to be protected and want the honest majority of the industry to gain? So if we can find a way of getting government to accept these things, great. Otherwise, how can we get them adopted as amendments, voted through and accepted by Parliament? So there we are. Those are my slides. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I don't know if anybody wants to raise any questions or comments.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. I feel totally justified before we do anything else in asking everybody to join me in showing our appreciation to Mark. By the way, not just for the time of preparation in putting that presentation together and delivering it, but frankly also for the extensive range of other activities that Mark does to support the cause for better consumer protection. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Thank you. Absolutely superb. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. We will open up the questions now. So please raise your hand if you'd like to come in with a comment or a question. I can see that Mark is sharing the slide deck into the chat. You'll have access to those shortly. We'll also be circulating by email if for some reason you can't download it. We're going to go to Mr. Paul Carlier first of all. For those of you that may not know, Paul was significantly featured in the program, the Panorama program that's been referred to a couple of times. After Paul, we'll be going to Bryn Davies, a parliamentarian who particularly pleased to have with us today. Thanks for being here. Mr. Carlier, to you first. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Again, I just want to endorse everything that Mark and Andy have said, and kind of point out as well that I think that there's a lack of appreciation of the significance or damage that fraud or scams by against individuals, but also wider frauds like we've seen committed by banks against firms, and the damage that has to the wider economy. All of the money lost to these scams comes straight out of disposable income. Now, when you're talking, with the Panorama program that we were involved in recently, highlighted £1 billion per year. Well, that's all disposable income. What has happened since the program is that, it's proven to us that we lowballed it massively when it was called the £1 billion a year savings scandal, because the number of scams that we've been alerted to since, many of which involving the same characters, many of which dating back years before, so they were on the radar, is quite astonishing. I mean, it runs into billions, and also so much of it covered by the FCA's regulatory perimeter, particularly investment insurance. Well, I'm not going to go into the details here, but it shows that there's never been a greater need for reform of the legislation. FSMA does not cover it, and is actively being used by the FCA to, for purposes for which it was not intended. It's using exemptions to avoid investigating. It's using other exemptions to avoid sharing information, to the point where it's no longer misleading or disingenuous, but in some cases blatantly dishonest. The favourite one is we don't get involved or we don't investigate individual cases. I mean, this has been one they've used time and time again. A mortgage prisoner was told this on a case I was working on in 2018. 2 years later, we find out the FCA knew that they were one of 500,000 plus victims. And time again with BSU, GRG, the same thing's been used, and yet the FCA knew that thousands of victims were reporting the same thing, and the FCA refused to look on the basis that to all these individuals that they were individual cases, knowing full well they weren't. And just to highlight this, Mark Stewart and the FCA recently have gone on the record to say that they investigate all individual reports, largely in response to Panorama, and rightly claiming that to investigate an individual report or claim could nip things in the bud, and could also reveal that it's a much more wider thing than just this one thing. So much has been said about that, but only this week the FCA has come back to me regarding some significant intelligence and evidence I presented to them, and are refusing to look at it on the basis that it's an individual case. Now, this is contrary to what Stewart and the FCA have been recently saying. It's also contrary to the fact that the FCA know this is not an individual case, but incredibly, and this is where it beggars belief, they've said this despite the fact that the PRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority, who I reported this to originally, confirmed to me that this was wrongdoing. However, it was within the FCA scope and signposted me to them. So where'd you go? The PRA confirmed it was wrongdoing, said it was within the FCA's remit, and the FCA found a way not to investigate and use the same individual case. So, there's never been a greater time, for the legislation to be changed. And just one final thing, I could go on for hours, as Andy knows, but I just want to endorse something that Jennifer said earlier, that this combativeness. In the evening following Liz Truss's confirmation as Prime Minister, you're looking at the news, both sides, all I was hearing was, right, it's now time to go to war against the other side, from front benches on both sides. And it was just astonishing, right? It was all focused on defeating the other side, and everyone appears to be losing sight of the fact what their duties are. They just serve the electorate, address the electorate's problems. These are the people that voted you in. What are the concerns they have? Deal with them, and I think, as Jennifer said, it needs to be more bipartisan. Cooperation. I don't think there's ever been a greater time for hybrid politics, whereby you take the best of that the left, you take the best of the right, merge it in the middle, and you know, acknowledge the fact that certain things. I'm a capitalist, but for me, we need to renationalise energy. We need to renationalise the railways. It's time for hybrid thinking, and hopefully this bill will get some real cross-party support and start to make a real difference.
Paul, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. Bryn Davies, please, over to you. Particularly keen to get your thoughts, and then we'll be going to Ollie Smith at Morningstar. Thank you, Bryn.
Yes, I just by way of explanation, I'm a member of the House of Lords, and this bill, the forthcoming bill, is going to receive a lot of detailed attention in the Lords, I'm sure, and I certainly intend to take my part in that. And so Mark's introduction is extremely useful. This is setting out the potential for changes, and I'm very much open to people's ideas. I've only really come today to listen and learn. I accept totally the need for action to be taken in this area, and the bill provides a good opportunity to set out the issues that need to be addressed. I have to say I'm not quite as optimistic as Mark about the intention of the government in terms of this legislation. It's there is this element of throwing off the shackles of Europe and unleashing the potential of the British financial sector. I'm not as optimistic, and I think there's also there is a systemic problem with financial services that needs to be addressed in any legislation. It won't work if the underlying belief is everyone is of goodwill and we just need to have the right rules and everything will be fine. I think it's not something that will be solved once. It's a continual battle to keep the consumers' rights and requirements in mind. Over many years, watching and being part of the financial services sector in its broader sense, I'm not optimistic that just get everyone to follow the right rules will solve the problem. Rules are there to be got round. But I accept much of what Mark has set out there, and I hope we can work together to produce the appropriate amendments that we can consider in the Lords. So thank you for that.
Bryn, thank you very much indeed. We think that the single most important critical success factor in getting the amendments through, whether it's these or these in a different form, is the extent to which people can learn to work together and collaborate. That's the real message we want to get across today. So having people like yourself involved and supportive in general terms, Bryn, is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. After we've heard from Ollie Smith from Morningstar, Ollie, great to have you with us. I'm going to ask Ned Beale from Housebound, John Tenconi, and also Sarah Fry to briefly introduce themselves. Ned and John and Hannah are very important in this because we, the Transparency Task Force, simply do not have the capability to deal with the legal aspects of writing bills and writing amendments. We need to work with others to do that. And we are already aware that there are some parliamentarians who are keen to support our efforts, and we'll be making available people to help with the amendment writing. But we're also doing all we can to look outside Parliament to find people with sharp legalistic brains to help us as well. So if you don't mind, Ned and John and Hannah, please briefly introduce yourself in just a couple of moments after Ollie has spoken. Mr. Ollie Smith, lovely to have you with us. Good to see you again. Ollie, please share your thought. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy, and thanks for the invite today. Really appreciate it. I'm Ollie Smith. I'm a UK-based financial journalist covering the consumer finance sector in the DIY investment world. I don't actually want to focus on that, however. One of the things I found incredibly compelling and actually just utterly absurd about the Panorama documentary was the character of Philip Nunn and his seeming capacity to reinvent himself as a well-being champion. And while I'm not going to focus on that specifically or him, because I don't want people to feel pressured into making remarks about Philip as a person, I wondered if I could just get some reflections from anyone who feels it relevant, including the Blackmore sort of victims, about the way in which business people in the UK who've, clearly become wrapped up in quite incredible wrongdoing of sorts, reinvent themselves, and how we regulate that. Because it's an issue that seems to be endemic, not just across financial services, but across business more generally, that people seem to be able to act with quite a lot of impunity in rebranding themselves and remarketing themselves. And in the internet age, you'd think that was very easy to kind of debunk and deconstruct, but it seems to be the case that it's harder than you might think.
Ollie, I think you've put a really, really fascinating question out there. I'm going to go to John Robbins, if John's happy to comment on this particular matter. Some of you may remember John was featured in the programme quite extensively, and then perhaps also to Paul Stevens and his wife Jane, if they're happy to speak to this point as well. I think you're onto something there. In fact, I'll share this with you, Ollie. Some volunteers within the Transparency Task Force, Susan Flood, Paul Cardia and others, are putting together a matrix showing the interconnectivity of different people, quite literally going back over 10 years, showing how the same people keep popping up time and time again. So we're absolutely with you in relation to the concern about people being able to repackage themselves, Phoenix themselves and organizations just to carry on doing it. If I can speak bluntly, Ollie, it drives me nuts to know there are people who are quite literally being scammed today by individuals who are scamming people 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, that we know are known by the regulators because we and other parties have told them about it. It drives us nuts. John Robbins, if you're happy to please take yourself off mute, maybe turn your camera on. If you're happy to speak to this point, please do so. How is it that these individuals just seem to be so free to just keep popping up again? And then perhaps I'll go to Paul Stevens and his wife Jane to comment on the same issue. John, if you're with us, please do share your thoughts. Thank you.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Yeah, John Robbins. I invested £20,000 in Blackmore, and I featured in the Panorama programme as well. Yeah, my view on it. I mean, I invested into Blackmore. I didn't invest into Philip Nunn or Patrick McCreesh or anything like that. I didn't know that they were the directors of the company. My research into the company was based on Trustpilot reviews. I wasn't a financial expert by any means at all. I was just looking as much as I possibly could into Googling them. I did get advice to go with these guys. They were considered a safe option, especially when it came to reinvested into the bonds, because I did actually invest into Blackmore Estates to begin with, and then got transferred over to bonds because it was a safer option, because we had this insurance. But it was only after I'd invested all my money that I realised that the two owners of the company, Patrick and Philip Nunn, did have some dodgy dealings in the past. It was mainly media articles that I'd found where people have said they'd been involved in some dodgy sort of scams, and then they'd just changed companies. And that's really when I started to panic, when I realised then those two guys were involved. But yeah, so it was too late by then, of course.
John, thank you very much indeed. I can just begin to imagine how painful that whole experience has been for you. And on a similar theme, Mr. Paul Stevens, thank you again for being here. Some of you will recognise Paul's face from the Panorama programme. What are your thoughts about this apparent ability of people just to keep coming up again and selling one more flavour of scam compared to the one that they were previously selling? Thank you.
Yeah, hi Andy, hi everybody. How do we feel? When we first saw that image of him being this guru, it's not the same person we saw stepping out of this really nice car. I think it was in Dubai. We couldn't believe it. One, has he got the nerve? What does his family think of him? I believe everything else what John Robbins just said. But what we can't understand is, why is he still free? Why are they both still free just to walk the streets and carry on working? Why have they not been pulled in or questioned? These are questions that we want answering. But what hurts the most is we did our due diligence like John did before we invested into it. Even had like a 2 weeks cooling off period. But we were really happy that there was insurance in place, it was guaranteed, and it was put in place by an FCA approved Lloyd's of London broker. So we had no reason to think it wasn't safe. People say, oh, since the panorama, we've had some really horrible comments. People saying, oh, you're greedy. But we weren't greedy, because if we'd put the money into renting property that we did think about with my father-in-law, we could have yielded 12.9%. So we thought 9.9% is a fair one. But luckily, I've got a great family. So, you know, my father-in-law lost £20,000 as well as us. So we're okay. But still all unbelievable. But I'm just so happy that these people are here today and listening. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We're going to get a brief comment from Paul Kiley, then we'll go to Ned, then Hannah, then John. Paul, thank you.
I think the biggest thing for me, Ollie, is that the more I dig, the more I uncover the fact that the FCA, SFO, and other parties have been aware of these names. These are not new reports to them, and these are not new names to them. You know, as Andy said, we've put together almost like a matrix, if you like, showing the various connectivity, and some of this stuff goes back to when it was the FSA, not the FCA. So, you know, how you're not putting two and two together is beyond me. But one of the I could go chapter and verse, but one of the things I wanted to say is that if you look back to the Connell scam, you know, had the FCA dealt with that appropriately, and they didn't, because the whistleblower involved in that, George Patelis, confirms that, you know, the FCA themselves had crossed certain lines when they were first made aware of it, and they therefore didn't deal with it properly because they were implicated and or exposed by what had gone on there. So all you have then is a situation where they've handled everything thereafter in the same way. There's, you know, the first approach by the FCA is how implicated or exposed are we by this, and that determines how they act. If they're exposed or implicated, it gets shoved to one side or it gets buried. And I think it happened in this case that they ignored these reports. A year later, they realise, or the top echelon realised that they've been ignored. That implicates them or exposes them, and they deal with it accordingly. They bury it. And, you know, I think had they dealt with Connell effectively, would LCNF and Blackmore have happened? No. And I think this is the problem. Historic failure and historic dishonesty to conceal failure predetermines the outcomes of new and future reports. You know, Blackmore and LCNF were just literally waiting to happen. You know, so.
Thank you, Paul. Your comment just makes me, reminds me of one of the points that Mark Bishop made earlier, which I thought was absolutely spot on. Mark made the point that the FCA can't busy itself with fixing its problems if it continues just to deny them. You know, we have to get the FCA to effectively admit its failings and then get into solving those problems mode. That's absolutely vital. Mr. Ned Beale, I'd be delighted, please, if you would be happy to introduce yourself. Explain, if you don't mind, how the Transparency Task Force got to know about you, and please answer the question, why is it that you are happy to try to help with the work that's underway here? Thank you, Ned.
Thanks, Andy, and very nice to see everybody. So I'm Ned Beale, a partner at Hausfeld. We are a commercial and competition disputes firm, but with a real focus on financial services and consumer redress. I've acted for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fair Business Banking, chaired by Kevin Hollenrake, for a number of years. And we're currently bringing a judicial review against the Financial Conduct Authority in relation to interest rate swap mis-selling redress scheme and the exclusion of sophisticated customers. And Andy and Mark and the team have been instrumental in getting that off the ground. It's it's like Andy and Mark said, there's a real opportunity here. So it's really interesting to look at this. I have some experience in the area of legislation. I worked with Lord John Sharkey, the Liberal Democrat peer, earlier in the year to produce a private members bill, which would have brought commercial lending to SMEs within the FSMA regulatory perimeter, which we produced, got it signed off by the clerks, put it into the ballot, came 35th, so nothing happened as yet. So both me and my partner, Simon Bishop, who's also on the line, we're very happy to help subject to capacity if there are parliamentarians who think there is an opportunity here. Just to give 3 specific comments on the ideas that Mark set out so eloquently. On the FCA having its exclusion of liability, in common law, the general rule is regulators don't have liability to those they're regulating. So we might need to go a bit further than just removing the exclusion, I think, and actually produce a positive duty. But it's certainly something that we have been thinking about, not least looking at what happened with Blackmore bonds. On the duty of care, Lord Sharkey also introduced a private members bill in the Lords on this topic a couple of years ago. We had a chat before this call. He can't be on it. He's very supportive of all of the objectives. He wondered whether such a bill was more likely to be passed by the Lords than the Commons, and whether being put to vote in the Commons and being rejected makes it less likely to be passed by the Lords. Which, this is not my area. This is a Parliament, not law. But I just thought I'd pass that on. On the third limb, which is kind of the super regulator, I can definitely see where you're going with it. I just wonder whether more regulators is the answer, or whether we just need the current regulator to do its job. And with my kind of judicial review hat on, if you had an issue that you didn't think the FCA had dealt with, and then you made a complaint to whoever's sitting above the FCA, and they rejected the complaint, does that make a judicial review harder? So I do think it's worth thinking about those sorts of issues in relation to that idea.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very, very much indeed, Ned. I see Mark's put his hand up. He'd like to come in on something you just said. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much indeed, Ned, for your comments, and it's very kind of you to be offering your support and expertise in this exercise. As you possibly can expect, I kind of want to push back a little bit on your comments about the third amendment. For clarity, we wouldn't want it to be a super regulator. We wouldn't want it to be even a duff regulator. It wouldn't want it to be a regulator of any kind. What we see it doing is performing certain roles about scrutinising the regulator and ensuring that the regulator is scrutinised. So, for example, appointing some of the people around it. So the complaints commissioner would not be appointed by the FCA anymore. Similarly, the consumer panel. We think that it would maybe once a year produce a report at how it perceives the effectiveness of the regulator and the regulations to be, and those of course are separate issues. The reason why we think it's needed is because if the counterfactual is the existing regulator to do its job better, then you do get into the question, how can we make the existing regulator do its job better? And we think that transparency and accountability are the ways of doing it, and that this would create transparency and accountability. We realise that judicial review does this as well. I would again say for clarity, but I don't think we would be proposing that people could complain to this body. And this body would not opine on complaints. The complaints commissioner would still exist and would be appointed by it, but otherwise would be unchanged. And there would still be the financial ombudsman. That would still work in the same way, but its directors would not be appointed by the FCA. So it would not have an opinion about any matter in which the FCA was challenged about a specific decision that it had made, would have an opinion about its general performance over a period of time. So judicial review, I would hope, would not in any way be undermined. In fact, I'll just throw in this little left field idea. We suggested that it would be funded by a 1% levy on the FCA. This would mean that it would have about £6.4 million per year. Perhaps it could fund judicial reviews. Because at the moment, as we know, as you know, the hard yards of trying to crowdfund a judicial review, even when you guys very generously agreed to do it for a small fraction of the market rate, you know, it's a challenge, it really is, and we can't do it often. But if this body had £6.4 million, perhaps it could from time to time pursue judicial review when it felt that it was in the public interest.
That would be absolutely transformational, Mark. I mean, that really would be absolutely transformational. Thank you so much. Let's go to Hannah Fry, then we'll go to John Tenconi, and if Simon Bishop's still with us, let's hear from Simon Bishop, who's Ned Bill's colleague at Housefeld. Hannah, lovely to have you with us. Any initial thoughts come to your mind about what we're trying to do?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this call. It was a really interesting presentation by Mark Bishop, and really interesting to hear the stories also from Paul and John today. Just by way of brief background, I'm Hannah Fry. I'm a barrister from 39 Essex Chambers, and I specialise in commercial and financial disputes. I've worked closely with Ned Bill previously and represented the APPG on fair business banking before, and really here today to assist, if I can, as extra legal firepower going forward, subject to capacity, and happy to help where I can.
Thank you, Hannah. Great to have you as part of the team. It really is. Thank you so much. Let's go to John Tenconi. John, please introduce yourself and just share your general thoughts about the importance of what we're trying to do. Perhaps just stay away from the nitty-gritty about what we're doing, but just the importance of it, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy and Mark, for your presentation. By way of background, I am a lawyer by training. I've had 50 years experience in financial services, venture capital, corporate finance, and I've held a number of regulated positions under the FSA, the FCA, the PRA. I applaud what the Transparency Task Force is trying to do. From my perspective, I think the FCA is a deeply flawed body. It is Janus-like in the sense that it looks two ways, and it looks to conduct, and it is actually by its conduct regulation that it has any effect at all on consumers. And it looks to competitiveness, and it uses competitiveness as an excuse to allow some pretty extraordinary things to go on. I don't think there is actually any proper financial consumer protection within it. And so I think that the problems are deep-seated, they're endemic, they're systematic. There's no real consumer protection. They're operating in a very complex environment in financial services, very multifaceted. Many of the regulators don't actually understand the issues. I know that from discussions with them. And there are, I'm afraid, poor leadership qualities. But that is something that is similar in my observation to a very large number of institutions around nowadays. So I applaud this effort at Realpolitik by TTF. I'll certainly do whatever I can to help support it. My own view is that a much more fundamental root and branch review is necessary. I'm against layering all sorts of bodies that watch bodies that watch bodies that watch bodies, because the problem is that you're always up against the leadership issues and the confusions that can arise. And I think a root and branch review is necessary of the regulatory perimeter, both for products and people. And I fear that my solution to the angst expressed by investors that these people can continuously reappear and they go into these projects with very little regard for the outcomes is that there should be criminal offences involved.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it there. I applaud your efforts, Andy and Mark, and I will assist in any way I can.
John, it's great to have you as part of the team. It really, really is great to have you as part of the team. There's a growing movement around the world of people who are frankly fed up and frustrated about the lack of effectiveness of the financial regulatory environment, not just in the UK, but in many, many countries out there. Having your sort of capabilities involved, John, is going to clearly help. So, Mr. Simon Bishop, if you're with us, Simon, please do take a moment to briefly introduce yourself. Then we'll open it up to everybody else, and then we'll start bringing things to a close. Simon, if you're with us, please say hi.
Thanks very much, Andy. It's very good to see you all. My name is Simon Bishop. I'm a partner at Housefeld, and I work with Ned on various matters, but as he said, in connection also with the APPG's judicial review of the Financial Conduct Authority, which is ongoing. I'm very happy to be here and to help in this enterprise as much as I and the firm can. I'd like to really echo the positive sentiments in relation to Mark's presentation, which was very eloquent and highlights the issues well and poses some very interesting possible solutions. My only novel thought would be just to think, as Ned said, to think carefully about how these proposals intersect with possible judicial reviews, and in particular the current political climate and viewpoint with regards to judicial reviews and the proclivity of this particular government to look to dilute the effectiveness and the scope of them. And I think that that's an important consideration in how remedies to these issues are proposed. But I need not say more than that. I'm grateful to be here, and thanks again for the presentation.
Simon, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. Super. In a moment, we'll open up to everybody else, and then we'll start bringing the session to a close. We decided that, of course, it would be totally unrealistic to try to get by with just one quick meeting about these issues. So the plan of attack is that at least roughly monthly, every 4, 5, 6 weeks or so, throughout the endurance of the Financial Services and Markets Bill, there is going to be a meeting like this. It may be on Zoom, it may be in person, depending on various factors. So that's why we're calling this meeting number 1. For your information, I'm about to give you the details about meeting number 2. Meeting number 2 is going to be 12 o'clock until 1:30 on Tuesday, November the 1st. 12 to 1:30, Tuesday, November the 1st. Almost definitely on Zoom, but we're not certain yet. 12 to 1:30, Tuesday, November the 1st. There may be some, for want of a better phrase, subcommittee meetings beforehand. For example, it could be useful for Mark and folks such as Hannah and Simon and Ned and the legal representatives or legal advisors from various parliamentarians to get together on maybe a more frequent basis to deal with some of the nitty-gritty, legalistic, wordsmithery type activity as well. They could happen weekly. There's going to be a lot to talk about. In addition to that, we're also looking to create a group for people who want to exchange ideas by way of email. So some individuals will have a chance to join into that group as well, so we can get a really effective communication flow. I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is that it is clear that one of the most important, if not the most important, critical success factor in this endeavour is us as a cluster of individual human beings finding ways to work together. If we do that well, then amendments will probably be passed that will have massive long-term consequential beneficial impact for years and years to come. I don't want to keep having conversations with people in tears about the fact that they've lost life-changing amounts of money, that the amount of human cost and suffering caused by the chronic and catastrophic regulatory failures that have been taking place for far too long, that era really needs to come to an end. And for that to happen, we need parliamentarians to pass new laws to make sure that it all comes to a stop. So I'll go to gallery view so I can see everybody that's here, and just invite anybody to raise their hand, please, to let me know if you'd like to come in with anything else before we wrap the session up. Otherwise, we will bring the meeting to a close. Yes, we will. We'll be bringing the meeting to a close. Thank you all very, very much indeed for your attendance and your participation and your input. We'll continue to honestly share our thoughts and ideas with each other. We have nothing but good intent in our hearts, and with that mindset, I'm sure we can achieve a great deal if we're determined to do so. Thanks all. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Cheers, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Thank you. Bye-bye. Well, I do hope you found that video useful and informative in some way. Please do remember, if you haven't already done so, become either a subscription member or make a donation. Both of the links you need are coming up on your screen now. And they're also in the video description. Thanks again. Thank you.